What would you do if you found a helpless baby bear crying alone in the thunderstorm, miles away from civilization? Would you risk everything to save a wild animal that could grow up to be one of nature's most powerful predators? Well, that's exactly the impossible choice that 67-year-old Henry Patterson faced on a cold October evening that would change both his life and the life of an orphaned bear cub forever. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications to catch more heartwarming stories like this one. This isn't just another animal rescue story. This is a tale that will challenge everything you think you know about the bond between humans and wildlife, and prove that sometimes the most unlikely friendships can bloom in the darkest of circumstances. Deep in the mountains of British Columbia, where the ancient cedar forests stretch endlessly toward snow-capped peaks, lived a man who had chosen solitude over society. Henry Patterson wasn't running from anything. He was running towards something he'd lost years ago: peace. After losing his wife Margaret to cancer 3 years earlier, Henry had sold their home in Vancouver and bought a small cabin on 40 acres of pristine wilderness. Margaret had always dreamed of living off the grid, of waking up to the sound of rushing streams instead of traffic, of falling asleep under a canopy of stars instead of the glow of city lights. Henry was living their dream, even if he had to live it alone. His days followed a simple rhythm: wake at sunrise, tend to a small vegetable garden, chop firewood, read by the fireplace. The closest neighbor was 12 miles away, and that's exactly how Henry liked it. He'd grown tired of well-meaning friends who said he needed to get back out there and start living again. This was living. This was enough. But nature, as Henry was about to discover, had different plans. October in the Canadian Rockies can be unpredictable. One moment you're enjoying the golden warmth of Indian summer, the next you're battened down against an early winter storm that rolls in like nature's own freight train. On this particular evening, Henry was splitting logs behind his cabin when he noticed the sky darkening with unusual speed. The wind picked up first, that hollow whistling sound that every mountain dweller knows means business. Then came the temperature drop, so sudden Henry could literally feel the warmth being sucked from the air around him. Within minutes, what had been a peaceful autumn evening transformed into something altogether more ominous. Henry had weathered storms before, but something felt different about this one, more desperate, more angry. He tried to read, but found himself pacing instead, drawn repeatedly to the windows to watch nature's light show. That's when he heard it. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks, that phenomenon where gusting air through the trees can sound almost human, almost like crying. But during a brief lull between thunder crashes, Henry heard it again. And this time there was no mistaking it. Something was crying out there in the storm. Something small and terrified and completely helpless. Now, Henry Patterson was not an impulsive man. 67 years of life, 35 of them married to a practical woman like Margaret, had taught him to think before acting. Going out in a storm like this was dangerous, potentially fatal. The sensible thing would be to wait until morning, when he could search safely in daylight. But that crying, it pierced through every rational thought in his head and went straight to something deeper, something Margaret had always called his soft heart in a tough package. Henry pulled on his heavy rain gear, grabbed his most powerful flashlight, and stepped into the teeth of the storm. The wind nearly knocked him sideways immediately, and the rain felt like ice water bullets against his face. But he pressed on, following that desperate sound deeper into the forest. For 20 minutes, he fought his way through the storm, branches whipping at his face, the beam of his flashlight swallowed by the darkness and driving rain. More than once he considered turning back. More than once he wondered if he was chasing ghosts. Then his flashlight beam caught something that made his heart stop. Huddled against the base of a massive Douglas fir, soaked to the bone and shivering violently, was a bear cub. But not just any bear cub. This was barely more than a baby, probably only 3 or 4 months old. It couldn't have weighed more than 15 pounds, and every ounce of that weight seemed to be devoted to producing the most heartbreaking cries Henry had ever heard. The little cub looked up at Henry's approach, and in that moment something passed between them. The cub didn't run. It didn't even try to hide. It just looked at this strange human with eyes that seemed far too old for such a young creature. Eyes that held a depth of loss and confusion that Henry recognized all too well. Standing there in the storm, staring at this tiny, helpless creature, Henry faced a decision that would have challenged even the most experienced wildlife expert. Every instinct as a mountain dweller told him to leave the cub alone. Wild animals, even baby ones, belonged in the wild. Interfering with nature's course was not only dangerous, it was often illegal. But looking at this little bear, Henry saw something that transcended all those rules and regulations. He saw an orphan. And if there was one thing Henry Patterson understood, it was what it felt like to be alone in the world when you weren't supposed to be. Where was the mother? In all his years living in bear country, Henry had never seen a cub this young without its mother nearby. Black bear mothers were notoriously protective of their babies, rarely letting them out of sight for more than a few minutes. For a cub this small to be alone in a storm like this meant only one thing. Something terrible had happened. The practical side of Henry's brain ran through all the reasons why he should walk away. Bears, even baby bears, are wild animals. They carry diseases, they have claws and teeth. This cub would grow up to a 400-pound predator that could easily kill a human. Taking it in, even temporarily, was not just dangerous, it was potentially catastrophic for both of them. But the storm was getting worse, not better. The temperature was dropping by the minute, and this little cub was already hypothermic. Its cries were getting weaker, its shivering more violent. If Henry walked away now, he would be walking away from a death sentence. And despite all his years of living alone, of convincing himself that solitude was enough, Henry discovered he couldn't do that. Not to something so small and helpless, not to something that reminded him so much of himself in those dark months after Margaret died, lost, scared, and completely unprepared for a world that suddenly made no sense. Henry approached slowly, talking in the soft, calm voice he'd once used to comfort Margaret during her worst days in the hospital. "Hey there, little one. You're in a world of trouble out here, aren't you?" The cub watched him approach but didn't flee. It was either too weak to run or too desperate to care about the danger this large human might represent. When Henry reached out slowly, the cub actually leaned into his touch, seeking any source of warmth in the freezing rain. That's when he felt it. The cub was burning with fever. Its tiny body was fighting a losing battle against hypothermia and exhaustion, and without immediate intervention, it wouldn't survive the night. The decision made itself. Henry carefully scooped up the cub, surprised by how light it felt in his arms. The little bear barely protested, just curled against Henry's chest with what seemed like relief. Through the storm, back to the cabin they went, an old man and a baby bear, both taking a leap of faith that would change everything. Getting the cub back to the cabin was only the beginning of Henry's challenges. Once inside, with the storm still raging outside, he found himself face to face with a problem he'd never imagined. How do you care for a hypothermic, potentially sick, definitely orphaned baby bear? Henry's first priority was warmth. He wrapped the cub in towels and positioned it near the fireplace, but not too close. He'd read somewhere that warming a hypothermic animal too quickly could be dangerous. The cub was too weak to resist, which worried Henry almost as much as it relieved him. While the cub warmed, Henry did what he always did when facing the unknown. He researched. His satellite internet connection, battered but still functioning despite the storm, became his lifeline to information about bear cub care. What he learned both encouraged and terrified him. The good news, bear cubs were surprisingly resilient, and if this little one had survived this long on its own,
It had strong survival instincts. The bad news? Cubs this young typically couldn't survive without their mothers, and hand-raising a wild bear was not just difficult, it was usually impossible. But Henry had something most people attempting wildlife rehabilitation didn't have: time, patience, and nothing left to lose. The first night was touch and go. The cub ran a high fever, its breathing shallow and rapid. Henry stayed awake, monitoring its condition, offering drops of water from a syringe he'd found in his first aid kit. Every hour or two, the little bear would cry, not the desperate wails from the forest, but softer whimpers that sounded almost like a human baby. By morning, the fever had broken, and the cub's breathing had stabilized. More importantly, when Henry offered diluted honey water, the cub actually drank. It was weak, still disoriented, but it was fighting to live. Henry named him Buddy. Not particularly original, but it felt right. This little creature had become his companion in solitude, his unexpected responsibility, his reason to get up each morning with purpose. What happened next defied everything Henry thought he knew about wild animals and human-wildlife interaction. Instead of becoming more fearful and aggressive as he recovered, Buddy seemed to grow more attached to Henry. Not in a pet-like way, but with the kind of trust usually reserved for family. Buddy would follow Henry around the cabin, always staying close but never demanding attention. When Henry chopped wood, Buddy would watch from a safe distance, occasionally investigating wood chips with the curiosity of any young animal. During Henry's afternoon reading time, Buddy would curl up nearby. Not quite domesticated, but definitely domesticating the space they shared. The breakthrough moment came 3 weeks after the storm. Henry was outside repairing storm damage when he heard a familiar sound, but this time it wasn't distress. Buddy was playing, rolling around in a pile of leaves Henry had raked, making little huffing sounds that Henry realized were bear laughter. It was the first time since Margaret's death that Henry had heard genuine joy in his world. And it was coming from a baby bear who, by all logic, should have been afraid of him. As October turned to November, and November toward December, Henry and Buddy settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible to imagine just months earlier. Henry had contacted local wildlife authorities, but the nearest rehabilitation center was over 200 miles away and already overcrowded with winter rescues. They'd advised him to either bring the cub in immediately, a journey that would likely traumatize the already fragile animal, or care for it over the winter with the goal of releasing it in spring. Henry chose the second option, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe it was because Buddy had already been through enough trauma. Maybe it was because the wildlife experts admitted they were overwhelmed and understaffed. Or maybe, if Henry was being completely honest, it was because he wasn't ready to be alone again. Caring for Buddy became Henry's new purpose. He learned that bear cubs need roughly 20 hours of sleep per day, but when awake, they're bundles of curiosity and energy. He bear-proofed his cabin, securing food and metal containers and moving anything valuable well out of reach of increasingly dexterous paws. Buddy grew rapidly. By Christmas, he'd 3 times in weight and developed the confident swagger of a healthy young bear. But more remarkably, he seemed to understand the boundaries of their relationship. He was wild enough to maintain his natural instincts, but socialized enough to coexist peacefully with Henry. The winter months revealed Buddy's personality in ways that continually amazed Henry. The cub was incredibly intelligent, problem-solving with a creativity that sometimes bordered on mischievous. He figured out how to open certain cabinets, how to manipulate Henry into extra feeding times, and how to position himself for maximum warmth during their evening fireplace sessions. But Buddy also seemed to understand Henry's moods in ways that felt almost supernatural. On days when grief hit Henry particularly hard, Margaret's birthday, their anniversary, random Tuesday afternoons when loneliness felt overwhelming, Buddy would stay closer, more attentive, as if he sensed his human companion's pain. Henry began talking to Buddy during their daily routines, sharing stories about Margaret, about his fears for the future, about the strange comfort he found in caring for this unlikely housemate. Buddy listened with the patient attention of someone who understood that sometimes being heard was more important than being answered. "You know what, Buddy?" said Henry one snowy evening in January, as they both watched the fire crackle. "I think you saved me as much as I saved you." But winter couldn't last forever, and as February gave way to March, Henry faced a reality he'd been avoiding. Buddy was becoming less of a cub and more of a young bear. What had been cute and manageable at 15 pounds was becoming powerful and potentially problematic at nearly 60 pounds. More concerning, Buddy was beginning to show signs of sexual maturity and territorial behavior that, while still mild, hinted at the full-grown bear he would soon become. Henry had always known this day would come, had always planned for it, but planning and accepting proved to be entirely different things. The wildlife experts Henry consulted were clear. Buddy needed to be released soon, while he was still young enough to learn essential survival skills before his first adult winter. Waiting too long would doom him to a life of dependence that would be dangerous for both bear and human. Henry understood the logic, but understanding didn't make it easier. Over the long winter months, Buddy had become more than a responsibility or even a companion. He'd become family. The idea of releasing him felt uncomfortably similar to abandonment, a feeling Henry knew all too well. The experts recommended a soft release, gradually reducing human contact while providing supplemental food in a remote area, allowing Buddy to slowly readjust to wildlife while maintaining a safety net. It was the best possible approach, but it still felt like saying goodbye. Henry spent March preparing for the release, both practically and emotionally. He identified a perfect location, about 5 miles from his cabin, far enough to encourage independence, close enough for monitoring. He built a basic feeding platform and began the process of gradually reducing his direct interaction with Buddy. This proved harder than expected. Buddy seemed to sense the change in their routine and responded with confusion and, Henry thought, a touch of hurt feelings. The bear would search for Henry when he didn't appear for their usual morning walk, would bring Henry small gifts, interesting rocks, pretty leaves, once an unfortunate chipmunk, as if trying to win back his human's full attention. The day Henry had dreaded finally arrived, a warm April morning when the last of the snow had melted and the forest was alive with the sounds of spring. Buddy was now strong, healthy, and undeniably ready for independence. At 70 pounds, he was no longer a cub, but a young bear with all the instincts and capabilities necessary for survival.
The release location was perfect. A meadow surrounded by berry bushes and near a stream, with plenty of trees for shelter and foraging opportunities. Henry had been leaving food here for 2 weeks, gradually transitioning Buddy from human-provided meals to natural foraging. On release day, Henry packed a final meal in his backpack, not for Buddy, but for himself. He'd decided to spend one last day with his unlikely friend, hiking to the release site together one final time. The walk through the forest revealed how much both of them had changed over the winter. Henry moved with more purpose, more energy than he'd had in years. His grief for Margaret was still there, would always be there, but it no longer felt like a weight trying to drag him underground. It felt instead like a tender scar, permanent,
but no longer debilitating. Buddy trotted alongside him with the confident gait of a young bear ready to take on the world. He investigated scents, climbed trees with increasing skill, and demonstrated all the behaviors that proved Henry's winter of care had been successful. Buddy was wild, healthy, and ready. At the meadow, Henry set up the final feeding platform and stepped back to watch Buddy explore his new territory. The bear investigated every tree, every bush, every interesting scent with the thoroughness of someone moving into a new home. Then, in a moment that nearly broke Henry's heart, Buddy returned to where Henry sat and simply looked at him. Not with dependence or need, but with what looked remarkably like gratitude. For just a moment, the old man and the young bear regarded each other with the mutual respect of two beings who had helped each other through the darkest of times. Then Buddy turned and walked away, pausing once to look back before disappearing into the forest that had always been, his real home. Henry returned to his cabin that evening convinced he would never see Buddy again. The wildlife experts had warned him that successfully released bears rarely maintained contact with their human caregivers. It was better that way, they said, cleaner, safer for everyone involved. They were wrong. 3 days after the release, Henry was gardening when he heard a familiar sound. Not distress this time, but a kind of greeting call he'd learned to recognize over the winter. Looking up, he saw Buddy at the edge of his property, watching from a respectful distance. The bear didn't approach, didn't beg for food or attention. He simply acknowledged Henry's presence and then continued on his way. It was exactly the right balance. Independent, but not ungrateful. Wild, but not unfamiliar. This became their new routine. Every few days, Buddy would appear somewhere on Henry's property, always at a distance, always respectful of boundaries. Sometimes Henry would see him fishing in the stream. Sometimes he'd spot him foraging along the property line. Once, memorably, he watched Buddy successfully defend a berry patch from another, larger bear, a moment that filled Henry with ridiculous parental pride. These brief sightings became the highlights of Henry's days. He began timing his outdoor activities to coincide with Buddy's likely appearances, and started leaving occasional treats at the edge of his property. Not regularly enough to create dependence, but often enough to maintain their connection. The wildlife experts Henry consulted about these visits were cautiously optimistic. Buddy was demonstrating perfect post-release behavior, maintaining his wild instincts while remembering positive human contact. As long as he didn't become aggressive or overly dependent, the situation was actually ideal. By the following October, exactly 1 year after that stormy night that changed everything, Buddy had grown into a magnificent adult bear. At nearly 200 pounds, he was everything a wild bear should be: powerful, independent, and perfectly adapted to mountain life. But he still visited. Henry's cabin had become part of Buddy's territory in a way that defied typical bear behavior. The big bear would patrol the property's perimeter every few weeks, always respectful, never intrusive, but clearly checking on his old friend. And Henry had changed too. The man who had moved to the mountains seeking solitude had discovered that some connections transcend species, circumstances, and conventional wisdom. Caring for Buddy had reconnected Henry with a sense of purpose he thought died with Margaret. More importantly, it had taught him that love doesn't diminish when shared with unexpected recipients, it multiplies. Henry began volunteering with the local wildlife rehabilitation center, sharing his experience with other orphaned cubs. He couldn't save them all, but he could help. And sometimes help was enough. The anniversary of their first meeting arrived with another storm, not as violent as the original, but significant enough to bring back memories. Henry stood at his window, watching lightning illuminate the forest, and found himself hoping no other orphaned animals were out there struggling alone. Then, as if summoned by the memory, Buddy appeared at the edge of the clearing. The massive bear stood perfectly still in the rain, looking toward the cabin where warm light glowed in the windows. For just a long moment, man and bear regarded each other across the distance, no longer caregiver and dependent, but friends, acknowledging a bond that had saved them both. Then Buddy lifted his great head in what Henry had learned to recognize as a greeting, then turned and disappeared into the storm, wild and free and confident. Henry's story with Buddy became something of a legend in the local community. Wildlife officials used it as an example of successful rehabilitation. Neighbors who had once thought Henry was crazy for isolating himself began to understand that sometimes solitude chooses its own companions. But for Henry, the real legacy wasn't the successful release or the ongoing friendship. It was the lesson that healing sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources, and that purpose can be found in the last places we think to look. Margaret would have loved Buddy, Henry knew. She would have worried about the dangers, questioned the wisdom, and then fallen completely in love with the idea of their mountain cabin serving as a way station for lost creatures finding their way home. Because that's what it had become, really. Not just a home for a lonely widower, but a place where broken things could heal, where unlikely bonds could form, and where the wildness of nature and the kindness of humanity could coexist in perfect balance. The mountains that had once seemed like a refuge from life had become a place where life flourished in ways Henry never could have imagined. And all because of a crying bear cub in a storm, and an old man who chose compassion over caution. Today, 3 years after that first stormy night, Henry Patterson continues to live in his mountain cabin, no longer alone, but no longer lonely. Buddy, now a fully mature black bear, still makes his occasional visits, bringing with him the quiet satisfaction that comes from a job well done, a life well saved, and a friendship that transcends the boundaries most people think impossible. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most profound connections come not from seeking them out, but from responding with an open heart when they find us. It teaches us that healing happens not in isolation, but in the vulnerable space where we allow ourselves to care for something beyond ourselves. Henry learned that grief doesn't end, but it can transform. Loneliness doesn't disappear, but it can become solitude. And love doesn't die with loss. It simply waits for new vessels, often ones we never expected.
Their bond continues today, a testament to the healing power of unexpected compassion and the truth that sometimes the best way to save ourselves is to save something else first. The mountains keep their secrets well, but they gave up this one, that in the space between wild and tame, between human and animal, between solitude and connection, extraordinary relationships can bloom. Relationships that remind us that we're all part of something larger than ourselves, all connected by invisible threads of interdependence and possibility. And sometimes, if we're very lucky and very brave, those threads become lifelines,
pulling us back from the edge of despair and toward the light of purpose, connection, and hope. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that unexpected help can come from the most unlikely places. Subscribe for more heartwarming tales of the incredible bonds between humans and wildlife. And let us know in the comments, what's the most unexpected friendship you've ever witnessed or experienced? Remember, every animal deserves a chance. Every person deserves hope. And every story of compassion makes the world a little brighter. Until next time, keep your hearts open to the magic that surrounds us in the natural world.